Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined today by longtime colleague and friend Harvey Kronberg, publisher of the Quorum Report, properly Harvey Kronberg's Quorum Report, not to confuse the branding here. You know, one of the longest running and most widely read insider news services in Texas politics. Harvey, thanks for journeying to campus on a hot day.
Always my pleasure. It's return to the University of Texas. I graduated in 1972.
Scene of the crime.
Yep.
So to speak, roughly speaking. Most statute of limitations on that stuff.
You just anticipated what I was about to say.
That'd be over. Yeah, we checked with legal. So look, let's just jump into it. I thought we'd start with the ripples of the presidential race and the politics of the presidential election in Texas. You know, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. Amidst the overall trend of, what is often referred to, I think with a little bit of overstatement, the nationalization of politics in Texas. I mean, I think it's largely true, but we can run a little too far with that, but we'll unpack that some. It's been a pretty active 6 weeks or so. I was out of the country for a couple of those key weeks, and it was interesting how much can go on. We don't have any data in Texas yet, but it does seem logical to think that the same tide that is lifting Democratic votes seemingly across the country in the wake of Biden deciding to drop out of the race, Kamala Harris sort of sliding fairly friction-free into the top spot, that same tide that's giving Democrats a boost nationally will help Democrats here. So so the question then is, how much? As you flagged, we'll probably disagree about the extent of this a little bit, and we know from knowing each other a long time. But I think it's a fair question, and I'm wondering how you're sorting that out. Especially at this moment where we're still waiting on data.
Let me start by saying if Democrats succeed in Texas or have a good cycle in Texas, it'll be despite the Texas Democratic Party, which is essentially useless and non-functional.
I'm glad we got that out of the way.
Yes. Now, having said that, county Democratic organizations are showing signs of life that we haven't seen in a long time. And I will point out that Beto O'Rourke, who was a deeply flawed candidate 2 years ago, won 11 of the 13 largest counties. The only reason he lost was because of rural Texas turning out in the order of magnitude that it did. This is a presidential year, and rural Texas will have dramatically less impact. So let's start with the predicate of the 11 of the 13 largest counties have already established their Democratic bona fides. And having said that, I would also point out that, again, after the 2022 gubernatorial election, national media contacted me and asked, was Texas ever going to be investable for Democrats? And I said, we don't know because we haven't had one that you could invest in. Beto O'Rourke had Dobbs and never ran a single commercial on women's health. There was a group called Mothers Against Greg Abbott.
You're thinking of 2022 now.
2022, correct. But this is obviously lays the groundwork for where we're going. In 2022, Mothers Against Greg Abbott, a little grassroots women around the kitchen table organization, raised enough money to do 1 week of commercials. And in that 1 week of commercials attacking Abbott on the issue of abortion, Abbott's internal polls, as reported to me, went from a 12-point spread to about a 5-point spread in a single week, which tells you the latent, if somebody makes the argument, the latent power of that argument. So my suspicion is that obviously it's going to be a pretty good year for. Oh, I should also add that in 2016, Trump won with 56% of about 8.5 million votes. In 2020, Trump won with only 52% of 11 million votes, and I don't think he's going to hit those numbers this time. I feel no sense of groundswell. Your polling may prove me wrong, but anecdotally there's no sense of enthusiasm behind Trump, and intensity is obviously what can carry elections, voter intensity. Having said all of that, I think it's going to be a good year for Democrats. I think that Colin Allred will probably spend $100 million or $80 million branding Ted Cruz as the face of the Dobbs decision, all of which is going to help up and down ballot. And so I'm guessing I'm going to put the possibility out there, believe it or not, that Trump could actually win Texas. At 52% is his high water mark. You add RFK, who's going to be on the Texas ballot, scraping 2 or 3% off. If he scrapes 2 or 3% off, it'll be on the Republican side. And I'm not predicting. I'm simply saying I haven't seen a setup like this for Democrats going into an election, actually since about 1994.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting, now in 1994, not the greatest year.
Right, for Democrats.
Right, for Democrats still.
Right.
I mean, now, different point in historical trajectory and all that. I mean, I guess as I think about that, the way that I've kind of been parsing this out, and again, without seeing how the numbers are going to move here, if at all, is that, prior to the debate, the presidential debate, and Biden dropping out, what it looked to me, based on the poll numbers and where the relative enthusiasm was, and you're right, I mean, up to this point, Democratic enthusiasm has been down compared to Republican enthusiasm. Trump's numbers were steady, not stellar, but steady and strong. And Biden's were very soft, in particular among Democrats, not, among Democrats and among independents. Now, independents right now kind of hate everybody, which is also part of the opportunity, I think, for Democrats. But, before all the big changes happened, what it looked to me, looking at that same series of presidential results you were talking about, where the gap, the margin at the top of the ballot among presidential candidates has been going down. Obviously, the statewide races, you've got the 2018 O'Rourke, 2018 exception generally. Mm-hmm. But at the presidential level, the trend was headed in one direction. And what it looked like to me at that point was that Biden's weakness was going to bend that curve back up a little bit. So in other words, if you look at Hillary Clinton losing by a little less than 9, and then Biden losing Texas by about 5.5, 5 3/4, right? That if you expected that trend line to keep going, we'd be, maybe a little bit below 5.5 this time. Mm-hmm. The Biden weakness made me feel like, as we were looking at early Trump leads of between 9 and 12, depending on the polling, it looked to me like they were set to bend that curve back up on the assumption that, those early numbers,
Oh, you mean the bending the curve back up in terms of
spread of loss. Other words, it would have gone back up to.
Yes, it would have.
Probably somewhere between 5 and 9.
Yes.
Right? But now, I think your scenario is more plausible. It's just how much further down can you bend it? And, I don't have a clear sense. I mean, I'll be shocked if the Democratic numbers aren't significantly better next time, and the kind of measures that we're seeing in other polling. I think it makes sense to expect that Harris's approval numbers will go up. They'll go up pretty dramatically, probably, or noticeably anyway, among Democrats. Big question is going to be, what does she look like among independents? And, where are the Trump numbers? Because I think the independents have to be a piece of the recipe that you're kind of putting together, that you're cooking up over there.
Right.
Some independent
the independents
terms,
are the whole game.
That and, increasing Democratic turnout, so that, and this goes back to the old debate we've heard a million times, right? Do you focus on running up the numbers where you already have an advantage in those large counties you're talking about? How much do you try to peel off a little bit in rural areas? That seems to me to have not been a very successful strategy.
Not a good allocation of resources.
Losing, to the extent that I think part of what's happening there too is, even if Democratic efforts are maybe driving out turnout on the margins, you're also losing some rural Hispanic votes, which I think is an underappreciated part of the shift in Hispanic votes, right?
South of I-10 will tell us a lot about the future of Texas.
But there's a lot of insulation here. I mean, I'm interested in your point about abortion. I mean, this has been, an argument that we've seen a lot among Democrats, that abortion is the issue. And, it's the indicators on that are mixed because there's a lot of noise out there.
But they haven't lost an election where abortion's been the central issue.
Well, not
since Dobbs.
Nationally, yeah.
Well, statewide, too. Well, you're talking, I mean, other states.
Yeah.
Kansas,
In other states. And I think, part of the structural issue that I have a hard time getting over here that you alluded to, which is, one, can the Democrats demonstrate the organizational and resource wherewithal to effectively mount the kind of campaign you're talking about? And I also think that there is a public opinion piece that, is a little vague in Texas. So when we ask in various ways, what do you think is the most important problem? What do you think the legislature should look at in the primaries? What is driving your vote? Abortion has a presence in the Democratic mindset. But as you well know from years of following politics and knowing, it's crowded up there. Democratic headspace, very crowded when it comes to issues. Now, I think abortion is a good mobilizing issue. The extent of that, I think, just, is going to depend a lot on execution and also just how the issue set evolves as we get closer to the beginning of early voting here in October.
Let me put 3 predicates out there.
Yeah.
And I hope I can remember all 3. I don't want to have a Rick Perry moment here. But the first is eventually the Trump campaign will reset despite its at the top of the ticket. And they will start branding Kamala Harris, and we'll see how successful they are. At the moment, she looks unstoppable, but let's not forget that at one point Dukakis had a 14-point lead, and it evaporated overnight.
And she has nowhere near that.
Right. I mean, she's above the margin, or in the margin, or above the margin in the battleground states by the current polling. Second,
the averages are still pretty in the margin, I think. But
second, the Republican Party of Texas is even more useless than the Texas Democratic Party, but they have external structures that Democrats don't have. And so, for instance, they're far more successful in registering new arrivals from the West Coast than Democrats have ever been. And they know where their voters are. But third, the disaffection, this is purely anecdotal, and your polling will prove me wrong, I'm sure, but anecdotally, I have a number of silos of what it's wine tasting groups, but they're essentially
That's a good
white Republican gated community males. And all of them, virtually all of them, are 1 or 2-time Trump voters. And at least at the moment, 90% of them say they can't go back there. Now, that, again, purely anecdotal, but to see that kind of transformation, and this is all being driven by the president former president being totally out of control on them in front of a microphone now, and just being mean. And so those 2 of those 3 things work for the Democrats. Work for the Republicans. The third works for the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I don't know what the extent of that. I mean, I think the wine tasting sample probably is a fairly specific band of the Republican electorate. But I mean, that's always been the question, right? Or that part of the question is what is Trump's floor and what is his ceiling? Mm-hmm. And his floor, I think, is still pretty high. And, the ceiling issue with that crowd, I mean, the crowd, the kind of social, the type of Republican,
right?
The portrait that you're playing, I mean, that is, that's been his soft spot. I would also say that many of those Republicans have complained mightily and then swallowed their objections.
Right? Do they come home? And independents, as we both know, call themselves independents, but they tend to break Republican.
Well, and I think what we look at is like the real independence, right? So yeah, I mean, in terms of, if you take the 3-point independent measure as a third of the electorate, which is absurd, just absurd, right?
Yep.
Then, yeah. But I mean, I think, but even then, the 9 to 12% that we get is like true independents with no leaning tendencies. And that, that moves. People move within those groups. They move back and forth. That's why I say 9 to 12, 9 to 14. They're a prickly bunch. I mean, yeah, in Texas, they lean in a conservative direction, particularly on the issues that are top of the agenda. But they are, to your earlier point, that lean is not as pronounced when it comes to abortion. Correct. And particularly prohibitionist abortion. I mean, the sweet spot for independence is probably the exceptions zone, for, rape, incest, threats to the life of the mother. But since that in Texas is sort of off the table, it does make you wonder about, just how much leverage you can get and whether Democrats can find another point.
Well, we're about to see a series of commercials of women who had to go to court and were still ultimately denied medical care they needed.
Yeah.
I am not going to say that that's a universal problem for women voters, but it's a substantial problem for women voters.
Well, and, yes, particularly younger Democratic women. Younger and Democratic women.
I'm going to disagree with you. I think that once it's framed and it becomes a battle cry, you're going to peel off a substantial number of historically Republican voting women.
What do you think? What do you think of as a substantial number?
I would be surprised if you don't see 25% erosion among Republican women.
That's a lot.
I know.
Yeah, I'd be surprised. I mean, I'm trying to think about what we see in.
Just because
Republican women are not. I mean, there are some Republican women that are uncomfortable with abortion, but
again, we're going to have $100 million spent turning Ted Cruz into the face of Dobbs, and it's going to be. Remember, Beto never ran a single TV spot.
Right.
On post Dobbs. He was given that gift. He had $60 million. We don't know the resonance, but again, in virtually every world I operate in, the intense. It may be showing as number 3 in your polls after the aborter and the economy, but when highlighted, it's very difficult for me to believe that it's not.
No, but that's the trick, though, right? Is that can you? This goes back to the Democratic resources. You said $100 million on the All Red campaign. That will not be happening in a vacuum.
Correct.
And every Republican candidate will be running on the border.
Yes, but we still have that wonderful picture of Ted Cruz refusing to answer reporters after the Supreme Court decision. Now, maybe the border has sustained its intensity. When we get into campaign mode, we'll find out whether Trump's rejection of the bipartisan border deal has any resonance or not. But at least it's a talking point, and it's potentially a substantial talking point. But the border is obviously going to be. I think the economy is actually going to fade here in Texas because we're in a better situation than most obviously. But we'll see. I remain convinced that the exit, if you trust exit polls, which are also, I think we'll see pretty high voter intensity on women's health. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And how that's distributed, which I still think will be a bit uneven.
And don't forget that Texas is still, banned, prohibits.
Yeah, no, that's kind of what I was getting at is that, I mean, because, particularly among independents, but also among some Republican women, the overreach on abortion in the state and the way that all is in it is a factor, I think. Well, let's, you've mentioned this a couple times in glancing. What do you make of where the Cruz All Red race is right now? It's been awful quiet to date.
It's All Red doesn't need to engage personally. It's going to be an air war, a television war. Ted Cruz's polling must show he's in trouble because after 2 terms in office, he's suddenly touting his bipartisan rhetoric, trying to work with Democrats and have some accomplishments. Obviously, I think it's too little too late. He will be defined by abandoning the state during Uri, green eggs and hams, bringing the government down, or attempting to bring the government down, collaborating with House members to undermine the Speaker in the House, which was it used to be an absolute no-no. Now Dan Patrick is doing the same thing here in Texas.
It's now just in the playbook.
But anyway, having said all that, I think that this more resembles the Cruz-Beto battle, and I think it's probably a 2-point race one way or the other. And from the Democratic perspective, you don't have to waste $30 million building the Cruz brand.
Yeah, I mean, the polling on that has been interesting because you've got a lot of people that have been running, or some people that have been running likely voter models, and getting that race at a 2-3 point race. I have questions about what a likely voter is in April, May, June.
Right. When you're trying to think of which beach you're going to go to.
Yeah. And just, if you look at the underlying numbers in that polling, aside from in the horse race, you're picking up a lot of just partisanship. And that doesn't mean the numbers don't mean anything, but that's what you're picking up. When you look at the fave-unfave ratings of Allred, and 20-25% of Democrats still don't have a view of him. Now, in our polling where we're not doing likely voter screens yet, we're having Cruz up by, 11 or so, which a lot, some other, polls that are still doing RVs without doing likely voter screens are finding it in that range still, right? So, I expect that race to tighten.
Well, I don't think Allred's a particularly good candidate.
I was just going to say, but I think, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I think the Allred campaign is going to kind of have has a decision to make that I think they've not made yet. And that is, they were picking the entirely plausible strategy of keeping Joe Biden at
arm's length.
Arm's length doesn't even capture, the
Joe
metaphor fails, right? And thus far, they seem to be keeping their distance from the Harris campaign. I think that is, pending how some of these redefinition battles go on and Republican efforts to brand her as, I think inappropriately as some kind of, left-wing radical, right? I'm not sure that is helpful, that if the momentum, even if the inevitable cooling of the initial Harris sort of momentum, if that eventually cools, I'm still not sure that the math isn't different if you're calling Allred in how you relate to the top of the ticket compared to Biden. And I'm going to be interested to see what they do. I don't,
Yep.
I'm not giving advice. I don't, and I honestly don't have a strong feeling one view or the other. But it does seem like, it is a different race. And for Colin Allred and the, what's the best word? The strategy and I hate this word, but the optics of him still continuing to keep a black female candidate at arm's length. It's a little tricky.
Yep.
It's a lot trickier than keeping 82-year-old Joe Biden at arm's length. I mean, nobody even questioned that.
Right.
Right. I mean, because everybody, it's like everybody was doing it.
Well, remember, incumbents don't get beat, they get fired.
Yeah. And so I don't, I kind of wonder about that, but we'll see.
And
I don't know. Do you think he shifts? Do you think they keep? Look, the conventional wisdom would be, look, they're gonna, whatever you think, she is a black Asian woman who served with Joe Biden. She is going to be seen negatively in Texas as a liberal, and let's to be honest, a liberal, a black liberal from San Francisco Democrat. Why would you change strategies? So I get that. I don't want to, come across as an idiot here.
One of the fundamental problems that Allred has is that historically Latinos don't vote for African Americans, and that's an important part of the Democratic coalition. I think maybe it's too nuanced for this kind of campaign, but he separates himself from her on the border and then is joined at the hip on pretty much everything else. And you mentioned she's African American, she's Asian. Well, she's also can be defined as an Indian American, and we have at least 3 amazingly large communities, 2 of which have been in all 3 are actually in historically Republican communities. Collin County, Fort Bend County have huge and very wealthy Asian Indian populations, and the Irving area is similar. They engage in politics, they have money, and how they're going to participate in Texas remains to be seen. And I don't know that there's a groundswell of identity politics over an Indian American, but I suspect that's something that we haven't really looked at yet.
And I don't know what those, I need to look at what those numbers are, but the broader point I think is well taken. And, an adjacent point is there's been a lot of interest, and for good reason, in the dramatic growth in the Asian population, Asian writ large, which is exponentially even more complicated than, talking about Latinos, quote unquote. And I think this is going to draw a lot of attention to that, and it's going to draw a lot of attention to how little we know about the political, from real, from in-depth research. Because I know from people on campus here, are kind of looking into it on our team, it's very difficult to pull the preferences of Asian immigrants and Asian descendant people out of the overall data, because even though the growth has been dramatic, the numbers are still very small. And so I think this is going to also throw a lot of fuel on, in terms of like my world, this is going to throw a lot of fuel on that fire,
right?
When this is over.
Well, their per capita participation, when you start testing, I'll be curious on the response, but my understanding is their per capita participation in elections is pretty damned high. Starts out pretty damned high.
Yeah, I mean, that's the general kind of sense. But, our ability to figure out, like, at the state level, what's going on with these populations is just limited, to say the least. I mean, and look, part of this is just the math, and it's, I was having a conversation with a new reporter in the area, just kind of a background lay of the land conversation yesterday. And we were talking about this movement, or, the alleged movement among young black males toward Republicans, in particular toward Trump. And, if you sit down and do the math and figure out what share of a sample is black voters to begin with, which is going to be around 12, right? Then you look at the numbers in that, and by the time you hone down to the black males that are 18 to 29 that are getting so much attention, you're looking at, maybe 10 or 15 cases, individual respondents weighted up in your average, in a 1,000-person poll. So the margin for error for this is like, to you put my science hat on, about 1 million. It's not 1 million, but it's, it's double digits.
I'm looking for those margins in my business. But.
And so, so we don't, that's going to be another interesting piece of the next round of polling in the state, and what we see going forward after this is just how solid those numbers actually were.
Well, if Democrats have a good year, it's going to be because of the coalition of a number of previously marginal groups that by themselves have low impact. But
well, I think that's one of the interesting to get. I mean, this is off the track a little bit, but hell, it's our show. We can do whatever we want. One of the things that's been interesting is, we look at the state becoming more competitive. And we spend a lot of time, on the big picture adjustments, in particular, I spend a lot of time on issue focus, because I think that is how you kind of lead public opinion if you can. And I want to put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that. But both parties, but in particular the Republicans, I think, have been doing a very precise job of realizing that it's worth it now to move smaller numbers of voters. And that's now has been enhanced for a long time by micro-targeting, the atomization of media consumption, all this kind of stuff has fed this. But it's fed at a time, if you go back to that trend we were talking about a few minutes ago, where, look, 20 years ago, when you and I were just becoming friends, what was the Republican baseline? If you talked to our friend Mike Basselis, he would tell you at least 10, it would, at that point, 10 to 15 natural advantage. That's not where we are now, right? And as that number gets smaller, and I don't think it's even, but as that number gets smaller, where that 10 years ago, I mean, we would laugh if anybody said, well, what about independents? It's like, I'll tell you what about independents.
Right.
If they're 9 to 12% of the electorate, and, you're talking about moving a point or two either direction, what about independents? They don't matter.
Right. Well,
not the case anymore.
I remember when George W. Bush went to the presidency and Rick Perry ascended to the governorship. He ran in 2002 against Tony Sanchez, and his his campaign manager at the time was Deirdre DeLisi. And I said, "Are you guys doing micro targeting?" And she summed up the Republican program in pretty much 3 sentences. She said, "Nah, we don't have to. There's 7 counties. They're 70-80% Republican. They're the largest counties in the state. We just flood those counties with media, whether it's mail, block walking, commercials. We know we're going to get a 70% turnout, and it's going to be 70% Republican, and that's pretty much all we need to worry about.
Yeah.
And the 10 largest Democratic counties in those days might get a 35 to 40% turnout.
Yeah.
And they were smaller counties to start with, so it has obviously become more nuanced, and the growth in those 7 counties at that point was pretty much all white. Now those 7 counties are increasingly diverse.
Yeah.
So in Harris County, for instance, theoretically they need the capacity to be able to teach in 60 languages.
Yeah.
Think about that. The most diverse county in the country.
And, huge amount of that are to our earlier conversation are Asian languages.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So let's get back down to Texas a little bit while we still have some time. So we were talking beforehand, state of play in legislative elections. I think you seem to see more potential for change than I do, and that I'm kind of hearing generally what seems to be in there. I think you've laid the predicate for some of that already. Like what are you watching there?
Well, very much. I will concede I'm an outlier on this, but I do have a bet with the former redistricting chairman that Democrats will gain 6. His was 3. He's kind of saying, well, you could be right. The premise for all of this is when you look
if we're talking about the same redistricting chair, he told me only 5 seats would be competitive.
Yep.
Which is, not unlike what we're looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that's unreasonable.
Well,
not that he's a disinterested party or that person is disinterested. But.
One of the ways we determine what a swing district is to look at the combine presidential with some down ballot performance, and then look at it district by district. Republicans now have 86 seats in the Texas House. You need 76 to have a majority. They've got 86. You can tell the state is transitioning because they had to draw some pretty thin districts to try and sustain that 86. 16 of those districts have under 58% Republican presidential performance, and I'm going to argue that that's eroded. Typically I would consider a swing district a 56% Republican presidential performance. It's not 100% guarantee, but it tells you what the swing districts potentially are. I initially counted 6 that I thought were exposed. I'm going to raise that to 8 or 9 now, if the Democratic momentum is sustained. And I base that to a large degree on watching what happened in 2018, where it was a referendum on Trump and Cruz. Trump wasn't on the ballot. Cruz was on the ballot. And it turned out a surprising number, and that was a midterm election. This is a presidential election, and I think the possibility of surprise is pretty enormous. And if I am correct, here's life's great irony. I think your listeners probably know the violence that Greg Abbott did to Republican incumbents, trying to eviscerate them. The pro-public.
We have to, in this environment, we have to, figurative violence.
Yes, yes. But pro-public school Republicans, he went into their districts and essentially lied about their records, got them beat with a not very distinguished class of newbies. Some of those have created opportunities. Some of those seats, Abbott primary wins, have created some opportunities for Democrats. But the grand irony is he spent $6 million of TikTok billionaire Jeff Yass's money to beat these folks. And the irony may be that if I am correct in this assumption, that we end up with 6 or 8 additional Democrats. He will have elected more Democrats, and the voucher vote won't have changed one bit. We'll see.
Yeah, that I have yet to hear anybody expect that much Republican success, because you've also got, if you count this on a net period, you've also got some formerly Democratic seats that are under some degree of pressure.
There's 2 or 3.
At least 3.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
34, 70, and 80 from mixture of retirements, and then you've got a couple of our seats that are clearly being contested: 37 and 18, Jenny Lopez and Lujan.
No, I would argue that Morgan Meyer's in trouble, Angie Chen Button's in trouble. The Steve Ollison seat is a potential swing.
The Chen Button, and what was the other one you mentioned?
Morgan Meyer.
And the Morgan Meyer seat. Those were both close races last time, right? So there's some reason to expect that they'll be under pressure this time with a more Democratic electorate.
And I can tell you the level of organization in Dallas County, we'll see if it actually, in the last 3 weeks, whether it executes, but it's pretty damned high. And they're making promises they're going to have a 60% Democratic vote in the election. And if that happens,
that's a pretty big promise.
I know.
I just want to flag. That's a big promise.
We'll meet in November 10th and see.
So you mentioned Governor Abbott and his relationship, such as it is with the House. I want to talk a little bit about, close with, as insidery as we can, I guess. Well, what's going on with the big three? Because it seems like the voucher fight, among other things, the Paxton impeachment to some degree, but the voucher fight has really shifted the gravitational field among the big three. And Josh and I talked about this in the podcast a bit last week. But after years of this really not being the case, Patrick and Abbott seem to me to be, the governor and the lieutenant governor, much more aligned now than they've ever been.
Issue-wise, but that doesn't mean that Abbott's not still afraid of Patrick. And that's historically been the case. He's been, well, let's just say,
stipulating that, it's not like they're going golfing now or something or whatever. They might,
You're not. Let's just say.
I think the political alignment right now, though, seems much closer. Whether,
Right.
I was describing this last week as like the three, it's the Texas legislature's three-body problem, right? You have these three centers of gravity that are inherently unstable. Been very unstable for the last decade or so. But if you go back, go back as far as you want, talk about Preston Smith and Ben Barnes and Byron Tunnel.
Well, one of the things we're making the assumption, historically we make the assumption that the Republicans will win the presidential election. Let's just for a moment think about what happens with if the Democrats win the presidential election. Generally, and if it's a 50%, if Trump wins with 1% margin, I think it changes a lot of the frames of conversation and the frames of legitimacy. After 2018, the Republicans had such big scares that it was actually the 2019 session was one of the best governing sessions that we've had in
this century.
Yes. They really did accomplish a lot, but that was because the Republicans were stampeded into good government.
Yeah. We were talking, I guess it was before we were recording, but, enough House members. And in addition to Ted Cruz and Lieutenant Governor had enough of a near-death experience compared to what they were used to.
Right.
That, you definitely had a different tone in that session, but then Joe Biden won in 2020.
Right. So if Trump loses, remember that Dan Patrick is the chairman of the Trump campaign and Abbott can't work hard enough to eliminate any space between he and Trump. That's a unifying principle at the moment. I think their natural impulses are to spin away from each other, and that ultimately that it looks like they're politically more aligned right now. But Patrick is just a wild card, loose cannon in a lot of ways.
Free radical.
Pardon me?
A free radical. Yeah. Just a bit.
Now,
that works.
After Abbott's performance in trying to destroy Speaker Phelan, although he never said he was trying to destroy Speaker Phelan, the joke has been, I'm not sure his people will get floor credentials onto the House side, but I think that Phelan made a number of political mistakes over his career where he deferred to the governor, and it proved to be a bad bet. However, I think that by the end of the session, we're going to be surprised at not how close. Whatever marriage, it'll be a marriage of convenience only, and it'll be episodic. But I don't think that it's a durable relationship I don't think anybody has a durable relationship with Dan Patrick that's sustainable over a legislative session.
This particular configuration has been inherently fraught.
Yes.
In terms of who are the big three are for this last decade.
The only thing it's been good for is the news business.
Well, I think what it underlines for me, and the way you said, well, they're in alignment on policy right now, and in a very narrow kind of way that has had real political implications. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that's lurking out there, this sounds like a Democratic talking point, and I'm always at pains to say, look, this is a read of what we're seeing very consistently in the underlying public opinion data, which is that there's still a lot of doubt out there about the grid, about reliability, and that extends a little into other areas of infrastructure and also invokes a general kind of declining trust in institutions, including government, including among Republicans. Mm-hmm. It's not, you don't have to go back too far, have that good a memory or been watching even that closely. They had to be watching a little closely to see that, The lieutenant governor and the governor were not on the same page in the aftermath of Storm Uri. And this issue has not gone away, given what happened in Houston after the last storm. And while everybody is currently has to date by everybody, the governing majority has done a pretty good job of finding people to blame. Initially, it was the ERCOT, the PUC, whoever was in reach to be shit-canned, frankly.
Yep.
Now it's Centerpoint. And that's not to say that some of these people
are not responsible.
Had some questions to answer.
A general rule of thumb is the louder the Senate screams, the more they're at fault.
Well, and and clearly as we were seeing these hearings on, that was going to be just usual interim hearing reporting on the previous legislation. The undercurrents among some of the senators, like the current and former chair of Business and Commerce, were pretty noticeable.
Who has been proven consistently right.
And, so that...
Even though he was punished for being right by the lieutenant governor.
So I point to that as an example now, but, that also goes back to our previous discussion, both here and before we came on, that, there's going to be a lot of moving parts in terms of, you're talking about Trump wins Texas by 1, but if Trump loses the national presidential election, and again, this is not a prediction, but the election were held today...
It's conceivable.
He's probably the underdog, right? Not by a lot, just by, I think the people that think, Harris is now running away with this, it's nuts, right? But I get the impulse, but a lot of pent-up desire for optimism among Trump opponents and Democrats. But if, Harris wins the election, and then we get, in a lot of ways, that's an easier playbook for Texas Republicans. It's a much easier playbook for Texas.
Much like the reaction to Obama in 2010.
Right, exactly, and to Biden in 2021.
Right.
Which is you go back to using the Democratic leadership in Washington as a foil. That means we find out how much more we can actually spend on border security. And it means other things to talk about as long as the grid, we don't have another big grid failure. But I think one of the things that we've seen is that our polling has shown consistently that every time we ask about people's expectations of either this future reliability of the grid or their assessment of whether the political class has successfully addressed the problem, people do not have a lot of faith that the problem has been.
No faith.
has been, there's some, but and it's gotten marginally better, but not very much. But, that just means it's latent and it's waiting out there. And I think the other thing that's happened is that the threshold for people paying attention to it has become lower. In other words, any time the power goes out anywhere on anything beyond an intensely local scale and there's collateral damage, it re-raises this issue.
Well, the only two reasons I would actually not disagree, but compliment. One is Beryl, obviously, with 2 million people for a week.
That easily met the threshold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, every 3 days on my cell phone, I get a text from ERCOT saying this is an emergency day. Please cut back your power.
And the thing is, honestly, there's nothing wrong with that.
Oh, no, it's promising.
From a policy perspective, it's the right policy.
Exactly.
It's the right thing to do. But because you've got these underlying attitudes, it has an activating effect, right? So that's kind of out there, and it's a wild card.
Well, on top of which, I'm going to toss another total wild card, which you'll roll your eyes at, but we still there's the possibility of a Ken Paxton indictment that's still hanging out there.
Yeah.
Feds are notoriously slow. I think the Blagojevich indictment in Illinois took 2.5 years of investigation. The grand jury in San Antonio is supposedly wrapping.
To this.
Yes. I think the grand jury was impaneled about 1.5 years ago.
Yeah.
So now, if the indictment were to happen, which obviously may be contingent on who wins the presidency, but if the indictment were to happen, I think that has a pretty serious impact in terms of legitimizing Dade Phelan for having initiated the impeachment, and problematic for Dan Patrick for having squashed the impeachment.
But let's talk about, so a cynic would say, so what?
Yep. Well,
and I'm not, and I don't, look, I think that's not a story any of those people you mentioned wants.
Well, let me just frame it.
Other than feeling.
It doesn't make any difference to the general public, but we're talking inside the 140
Yeah.
days of a legislative session and the interaction between the big three. And it's the contempt between Phelan and Patrick are palpable right now. If Phelan ends up being vindicated and Patrick disgraced, it effectively inside the building, I think, could potentially have a substantial impact.
Although, I wonder, though, if we're not completely internalizing the lesson of just how hard it is to really make that kind of stuff stick in a hyper-partisan / negative partisanship universe. Well, but I agree that if, I was going to say, I appreciate you bringing that up in the context you did, because what it kind of points to is like, what are the things that are lurking as we move into the next session, right? As we start thinking about the next session. And, that would mix things up, as would another big freeze in February or January, something like that, But then how that all, another surge in migration, depending in response one way or the other to the outcome of the presidential election. I'm going to ask you, because you just did something in that conversation, which was, assume that Dave Phelan would be speaker. That's the odds-on.
It's the odds-on. It's not a given.
Seems like the odds-on bet right now.
Of course,
the bettors are sometimes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, conviction doesn't necessarily mean outcome, but depends on if it's a criminal conviction. It definitely impacts outcome. But I think the fundamental reality is the Republican caucus, I think, is going to be smaller this next time around. Part of this primary season was this drumbeat to eliminate Democratic chairmen. There is no candidate. There is nobody that 76. There is no Republican that 76 Republicans will vote for.
Right.
That's just a given. So you are going to have to rely on Democrats. The question is, the Democratic calculation is Phelan our best shot. Phelan has disappointed them on any number of occasions, including that final decision he made on Sine Die, the closing day of the last legislative session. A Republican gets up. The Senate had sent over a school funding bill that did not have vouchers. It was a clean bill. If the House had passed it unamended, money would have gone to schools and teachers, and Phelan made a bad choice. He refused to recognize him for the motion to bring that bill up. It went away. And
our understanding is that was what the governor did not want us to have to decide to send
again. And then the governor goes out and tries to destroy Dade Phelan. So, which, one theme we haven't talked about is, does the governor have any legitimacy this session? I don't think so. Anybody that takes Greg Abbott at his word is a fool after this last primary cycle, including Dade Phelan. Having said all that, they passed sanctuary cities under Dade Phelan. The only thing that Democrats can claim, he didn't try and arrest him when they broke the quorum after the poison pill on the so-called election integrity bill was put in by the Senate 2 sessions ago or 3 sessions ago. But there are a number of alternatives, mostly older alternatives, but speakers races. Anybody who jumps out in front right now, like Oliverson or Slauson, obviously doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Speakers' races are decided.
There's a lot of speculation about whether this was a stalking horse for other ambitions.
Oh, it's not.
Which is
No, it was a stalking horse. Oliverson was a stalking horse for Patrick, no matter what he says. Slauson, a little more nuanced, but she carried the bill banning abortion. There's no way she's ever going to get Democratic support.
Well, a lot of the people that, we can talk about some of the veteran legislators, Republicans that are.
They will all shoot us if we mention their names.
Yeah, which we, it's a pretty thin fig leaf there. But they're not likely to be candidates.
No.
And, when you look at the candidate pool, a lot of the people that might have been thought of as Democratic alternatives are not coming back. And I think, whatever you think, however you view it. One of the things I did for a presentation is I took Mark Jones scaling, his Poole Rosenthal scaling of the relative ideological positioning of members, and I looked at the Republican spot and just went from left to right and crossed out all the people that aren't coming back. They are disproportionately from the section of that graphic that is closer to the center, and that's where other Democratic possible candidates might have been.
Well, Abbott did radicalize
Yeah.
And the one thing, it just occurred to me, we are so certain that that it'll be a Republican House. In 2008, Obama led a historic election, and we got 76 Republicans and 74 Democrats, which is a functional tie. I'm not predicting that now, but it is.
Well, you came close to predicting it earlier. You might as well stick by it, man. I mean,
maybe it's just wishful thinking, but it would be so much fun to be a political reporter covering a surprise Democratic win in the House that. And you can just hear the dominoes around the state of all the infrastructure built by 25 years of Republican dominance imploding. So,
well,
but it would be fun. It's not predictive.
Okay,
It'd just be fun.
Well, as long as we're fantasizing, I guess. But I mean, I think the analysis of where Phelan stands. I mean, I think I would have thought. I shouldn't even say that, just to admit. I mean, I thought he would be in more trouble given that he had the narrow escape that he had. But I think I underestimated the lack of alternatives.
And his single best credential is that he and Dan Patrick hate each other. Any other candidate, to a certain degree, is going to be suspected of being a stalking horse for Patrick.
Yeah, but look, I like talking to public groups or something, I always am reminding people that, the general public that doesn't follow this all that much, that, you have to take the institutional factors into account, and that there's a certain baseline, of ever simmering antipathy and contention between the House and the Senate. It's designed that way. If you're seeing that, it's working per design. I'm not saying it's great, it's not great, but that's per design, per specs. Right. But I don't wonder if, my question, and I have not talked to enough House members recently, is whether there is some exhaustion with that paradigm given what it's gotten people. And I don't know. I ask that as an open question. On one hand, I preface that with my mention of the institutional thing, because I believe that is very fundamental. But I also believe that, when you're an individual actor, after a few sessions of going, hey, if it's bad for Dan Patrick, it's good for us, and watching your colleagues fall around you and seeing, the bodies functioning in the way that the bodies are functioning, if people don't start thinking, I don't think it requires them to say, I give up, I love the lieutenant governor, I'm throwing my lot in with him. But if people aren't beginning to think about maybe there's a different way to approach this. And I don't,
If the presidential race is close in Texas, MAGA is discredited to a certain degree.
I don't know. Maybe.
Well, we'll see. But again, it depends on the numbers. The House is the only barometer we have. The Senate's not.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, we should close, we're going to get into the weeds here pretty quick. But when you say MAGA is, sort of discredited, well, it really does raise the question of what that really means. And it goes back to something that we started with, that, this nationalization versus, local, organic state level, what's bubbling up from, besides oil and gas, what's what bubbles up in the political culture here, that is influenced by that and maybe, reflects some of it, but is still distinct from that. And, what is a Republican Party with Trump having lost another election, but having already sort of liberated the spirits that he has liberated in the Republican Party, which in Texas predated Trump? A lot of the elements that we think of now as MAGA, I would say were very present within the first 3 years of the Tea Party movement here.
Oh, yeah.
So when you said that, that's why I kind of glitch at that. I'm like, well,
we'll still have Tim Dunn and Morris Wilks funding.
Well, and we'll still have, a pretty good clutch of, I would say, Republican House members and a few Republican senators that are between the age of 35 and 55, just to, I would even say 35 to 60, that are rooted in, the political soil that, spawned Trump, elevated Trump, spawned what we now call MAGA, that will be perfectly willing to rebrand a little but carry on a fight in the same category. So I don't know, and as we said, and if Trump loses, at the same time that people are saying, yeah, that didn't work, we have to carry on with our own thing. In Texas, going into our midterm elections, I think what that means is a bunch of people scrambling around in that space trying to pick up version whatever, version 2.0, post-Trump version, MAGA version 1.0, or also known in my mind as the modern Texas Republican Party version about 3 or 4. And I think that's what I think will be interesting about that, because I don't think the kind of, especially if Trump wins the state, even if he only wins by a point or two, I don't see it being delegitimized as a winning strategy. I think people, and I think we saw this in the interim between 2020 and now. People didn't push back on Trump, but I think there have been plenty of people that have been saying, I'll bet I can do this better. I mean, the most prominent national attempt at that failed with DeSantis. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of other people. I mean, look, it's like
the magnetism on this is the cult of personality. I mean, that's the glue that's holding it together. I'm not going to say those threads won't exist, and they may still be dominant in the Republican primary. But as governing principles, I think if Trump were to lose decisively, or it'll be a spasm through the Republican Party of total.
Yeah, rebranding and remaneuvering, and but
and being a party of addition. It stopped being a party of addition a long time ago. It's a party of subtraction right now.
Well, I mean, except that I think Republicans have convinced themselves that they're adding Latinos at a reasonable pace, which is
could be.
And so I don't know. I mean,
we'll see in Arizona, Nevada.
But I think that it's going to be, that scenario is a very fluid one. Do I expect the Republican Party after the last decade to suddenly, move back towards the free trade oriented center? I don't. I mean, I just
in Texas the only reason
Texas
the only reason they won't move back is because of Tim Dunn and Morris Wilks. There has to be a funding source for this, and essentially they paid for as you may know, the Republican convention ended up about $300,000, almost $400,000 in debt. Who's going to pay that? The same guys that essentially picked the new chairman and.
But the Republican convention is not. I mean, it's the center of something. It's the center of all this,
right?
But it's not. To your argument, perhaps.
I'm just making the case that there has to be a funding center, and if it's a conclusive election, that funding center boils down to essentially 2 sources right now. There's still I would argue, about probably 70% of overall Republican funding in the state. Not election funding, operational funding.
Yeah. I was going to say I don't know about that, but I also there are other people willing to jump in there, as we've seen.
Yep.
That are not named Wilks and Dunn, and that are not part of that thing.
And Jeff Yass, who bought 50.
You mentioned Jass. The Adelson. Miriam Adelson is obviously going to invest a lot of money here.
One last chuckle, of course, is the former president attacking Adelson, and of course Dave Carney, Abbott's.
But this is also why I think that to the previous discussion, if you remove, I mean, in some ways, Trump. This is the problem that a lot of Republican elected officials have. Trump is both the biggest resource and the biggest headache at the same time.
There will be a sigh of relief that they don't have to get questioned about everyone.
I have no doubt of that, including people that publicly, sing his praises. When he's gone, they will get up and go, God, I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. To my mind, that doesn't alleviate them from the ownership of having done it, but such it goes. Well, we could do this for a long time more, but I'm not gonna,
and we probably will off
but
camera.
I'm not going to. Yes, we'll continue this over sandwiches or something. So Harvey, thanks for coming. It's been great.
It's been fun.
Been overdue. You haven't. It's. I was looking last time you've been on. Last time you were on was 2022. So we'll get you back soon.
I still use the picture as my.
Oh, good.
My.
I like it.
ID. And I haven't changed a bit, nor have you.
No. I mean, identical. Yeah, I'm just going to say identical. So with that, thanks again, Harvey. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Not a data-heavy discussion, but of course all our polling results, thousands of downloadable graphics of every conceivable result for your presentations, teaching, etc., all available. Open access at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon again with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.